together to celebrate its accomplishments. But I want you to know that in the midst of all the recent loss and the suffering that you've been experiencing and the sadness here in this community, that there's something you need to be incredibly proud of. And that's that this community has been at the epicenter of challenging global drug policy and shifting the way people think about how they treat people who use drugs. This is not a small thing. And in many ways, the fight to open Insite and to keep it open was at the heart of this. Looking back, one thing I know to be a fact is that somehow our imperfections, our humanity, and our pain, we can turn into vehicles for action. They can propel us to do remarkable things, and often in spite of ourselves, especially when we're not afraid to tell the truth and to call out suffering and injustice. When I first came to the downtown east side in the early 90s, I honestly didn't know anything. I'd worked as a nurse in the emergency department, and I was sick of seeing people suffering and being treated poorly. So I left, and I thought my skills might be of some use in this community, but I had absolutely no idea. I was hired to run the original Portland Hotel, a place I thought was shockingly substandard in terms of the housing it offered. But from where I stood, we were lucky just to have a building at all. And when people in the community heard that there was a nurse working in the hotel, they sent loads of referrals. People who were not welcome in other places, people who used drugs, people who had mental illness, people who worked in the sex trade, people who smoked crack, people who had HIV, people who had involvement with the criminal justice system. But these were the labels, and they were just people. People that I loved and I cared about, and who were also our teachers. Our tiny team of staff attempted to provide a home for people who at that time were unwelcome in all other forms of housing because they struggled. And rather than being provided with support, they were cut off and left alone for mainstream services, but even worse, they were blamed. It was seen as their fault that they were unable to work. They were viewed as pariahs if they used drugs, and there was no sympathy for them when they lost their housing. They needed to meet arbitrarily dictated rules and policies that were set up by providers if they needed help or wanted it. And it went unquestioned when people were criminalized and died. But I was blessed with teachers that showed us generously by sharing with us their stories and taught us how to listen. And I cried a lot in the first years of being in this community, and story after story of people who were beautiful and kind and generous and funny, but who suffered unnecessarily due to an oppressive human-made system. People like Freddie Yates, Angela Jardine, Tilly Angus, Linda Gaines, Barb Daniels, Brenda Buxillier, Michelle Chartrand, and so many more. We saw how kicking people out of housing didn't actually make things better. Because without a home, it was really hard to do very much at all, to address anything that was going on in your life. So we established a non-eviction policy back in 1993. Because our view was that people who needed housing the most were the ones that we had to provide space for, and it was on us to figure out how to do that. We also deliberately wrote into the constitution of the PHS the word enabling when it came to people who use drugs. Because drugs themselves, it didn't seem, were the problem. In fact, for most people, they were the solution and they were keeping people alive. The relationship with drugs that people had formed was the one relationship that wasn't letting people down. So we allowed people in our housing to use drugs, and because of that, we were seen as bad parents. Somehow the expectation was that if you were a housing provider, you were responsible for the behavior of the people that you housed. But ultimately, providing this non-judgmental physical space, a desperately needed refugee, with acceptance, was where we could wrestle the system into trying to bring services to people who were alone. The message was, you don't need to deserve housing to be helped. Rather, our job is to listen and to figure out what you need and then to try and figure out how to get it for you. But the backdrop, as you all know, in the 90s was a wave of heroin overdose deaths. And those of you who are still here will remember how isolated and cut off the downtown East Side was from the rest of the city. Nobody knew and nobody cared what was happening here. But Osborne came and told us. He begged Mark, Kirsten, and I to do something because he had enough. He said we had to act. And Bud's invaluable voice and his love and his courage, I always remember as the author of that moment. The rest of the story to open Insite is one that you've been told many times and in many ways. And there are so many unsung heroes, many of you are here now, without whom the story of Insite would never have happened. For instance, the Portland maintenance team, Fawn, Krista, Patrick O'Rourke, Alan O'Rourke, who built every fucking cross that was ever planted in any park, and the thousands of crosses that were erected in every protest, including the one in Oppenheimer Park with the Killing Fields banner that really put this issue on the map for the first time in the national media. And as you know, after years of advocacy, in 2003 Insite opened, but it would still be another decade before any other sites would open in Canada. We forced change through the system at a cost. And it was still not enough, because then for 7 years we had to fight in the courts to keep it open. And as Dean said, winning unanimously in 2011. It really has been the greatest privilege of my life to be part of this story. But I guess what I think is most important that you all know is that this tiny piece of real estate that opened 20 years ago really has become a beacon. We were able to advocate years later in New York and use the lessons here to lobby for services there in the US. In 2017, we went and used CNN to do a story about the overdose prevention site we were running. And Sanjay Gupta ran a piece about the controversial project, and it got the full attention of the DEA who came and visited us the next day. It also happened at the great displeasure of the New York governor and some of his state officials. And all of these battles cost human beings, but none pay more than those who suffer from the unjust impact of these deadly policies. Yet somehow, from this tiny corner of the world, this tiny speck of a place on the planet, people have traveled from here all around the world to inspire change and to bring hope. And they've made change. They've made change to drug policies, housing policies, healthcare policies, and changes that say drug users are not criminals. They are not defined by what they ingest. And helping people is not enabling. As we stand here today remembering all the beautiful souls and the people that we've loved and lost, I want you all to feel so proud that their lives represent a ripple of change that would not have been possible without each of them and without each of you. So thank you.